Spartans, prepare your breakfast and eat well, because tonight we dine in Hades. That single line defines an entire legend, the phrase that transformed a man into an immortal myth. 300 soldiers, a narrow mountain pass, and an empire said to command more than 1,000,000 men. It remains one of the greatest stories of sacrifice ever told. But do we truly know the man behind the helmet? The films showed us the warrior. They showed us the king, but they never showed us the monster. Because Leonidas was not born a hero, he was constructed, piece by piece, inside the most ruthless training machine the ancient world ever conceived. He was broken, reshaped, and forged again in the fires of the Agoge, the brutal Spartan system that erased mercy, erased weakness, and left behind only obedience and death. This is not just the story of Thermopylae. That was the end. This is where it began, the origin of a human weapon, a man who killed his own compassion to become the perfect monster of Sparta. To understand who Leonidas truly was, you must first understand the place that forged him. Sparta was not like Athens with its poets, theaters, and philosophy. It was a bare and stony land whose people lived beneath a constant, paralyzing fear, not of Persia, not of Athens, but of themselves. The equals, the tiny caste of full-blooded Spartan citizens, ruled over an immense population of state slaves known as the helots. Those helots were the hands that plowed the fields, the bodies that carried the grain, the silent mass that fed the state. They outnumbered their masters 10-1, sometimes 20-1. Every harvest season, every nightfall, Sparta lived with the same nightmare that the helots might rise and strangle their masters in their sleep. This single fear shaped everything the Spartans ever built, their laws, their children, and their king. To survive, they created a machine of terror and discipline. It was not an army in the ordinary sense. It was a society weaponized against itself. The Cryptia, a secret brotherhood of Spartan youths, roamed the countryside after dark, hunting the strongest or boldest helots, killing them without warning to keep the rest in submission. It was both population control and education, a lesson that survival came only through domination. And in this grim world, sometime around 540 BCE, Leonidas was born. He was not born to luxury, he was born into fear, and fear was the truest teacher Sparta had to offer. He carried royal blood, a descendant of the Agiad line, yet that title meant little in a city where every child, noble or common, belonged to the state. At 7 years old, he was torn from his mother's arms and thrown into the Agoge, Sparta's merciless training system, the furnace that melted boys into weapons. It was not a school. It was an industrial process of dehumanization. Each child received a single cloak for the year, no shoes in any season, and a bed of river reeds he had to cut for himself. The boys were kept hungry by design, forced to steal their food and beaten not for stealing but for being caught. The lesson was psychological as much as physical. Cleverness meant survival, failure meant pain. Older boys ruled the younger ones with sanctioned brutality, creating a hierarchy of cruelty that trained every level to obey and to command. The daily beatings were not punishment, they were ritual. They taught that pain was irrelevant, that emotion was weakness, that silence was strength. Imagine an entire childhood spent on the edge of starvation and exhaustion, under a sun that burned like bronze in summer and a frost that cut like knives in winter. In this world, the young Leonidas learned what every Spartan was meant to learn, that life itself was a form of warfare and compassion was an enemy. Most boys came out of the Agoge hollowed, obedient drones whose individuality had been burned away. Leonidas came out sharpened. He discovered something rare. Pain could be used as fuel, and fear could be bent into focus. Where others collapsed, he adapted. Where others endured, he learned to command. The Agoge taught him the principle of laconism, the economy of words. Never speak more than needed. Never explain. Every phrase should strike like a spear. And behind that silence grew a cold precision that would one day rule men and face empires. Sparta's purpose was never conquest for glory. It was control through terror. Its entire structure existed to keep the helots chained and the Spartans honed. The city was a fortress of obedience, and Leonidas became its perfect reflection. By the time he emerged from 13 years of brutal instruction, he no longer resembled a child of any family but a product of the state, a soldier built to suppress revolt, to kill without hesitation, to lead without emotion. He had become the very answer to Sparta's fear. He was their ideal creation, a man without mercy, a ruler who would rather die than show weakness. And though history would remember him for a single battle against Persia, the truth began here, in this barren cradle of stone and blood, where a boy's humanity was stripped away so that a legend could be born, while Leonidas was being hardened in the darkness of the Agoge. The real war of his life was already beginning in the royal palace of Sparta. He was not the only son of King Anaxandridas. There were three brothers, Cleomenes, the eldest and rightful heir, Dorius, the second-born, fierce and arrogant, and Leonidas, the youngest, the one destined never to rule, the one no one thought would matter. In Sparta, bloodline meant little without strength, but the rules of inheritance were clear. The firstborn son would wear the crown. Cleomenes would one day sit on the throne, Dorius would serve under him, and Leonidas, the third, would live in his shadow forever. Yet it was this small detail, this accident of birth, that would turn him into something Sparta had never seen before. Not being the heir meant he would not be protected by privilege. Like every other boy, he would be thrown into the furnace of the Agoga. It was not the path of kings, but of wolves, and in that fire the last of his softness burned away. When the years of training finally ended, Leonidas returned to a city still locked in its endless cycle of fear and obedience. Yet he carried within him something new, a kind of unbreakable stillness that even his instructors had learned to respect. But the palace he came home to was a place of tension and suspicion. Cleomenes, the eldest, had already taken the throne of his father and ruled as one of Sparta's two kings. He was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly unpredictable. A man who could inspire loyalty one moment and destroy it the next. Dorius, his younger brother, was the opposite. Disciplined, proud, and burning with resentment toward a brother he saw as unworthy of the crown. Their rivalry split the royal household like a blade. Sparta's unique system of dual kingship, meant to prevent one man from gaining too much power, had instead created a war of bloodlines where jealousy and rage boiled beneath the marble silence of the palace. Cleomenes, raised outside the Agoga as royal heirs often were, had never tasted hunger or felt the whip of discipline on his back. He was a politician wearing armor, clever with words but soft inside, and Dorius despised him for it. The true Spartan, forged in sweat and blood, now had to kneel to a man who had never earned his scars. To Dorius, that was unbearable. His pride could not survive under the weight of his brother's crown. The fire in him turned to rebellion. Gathering a band of loyal warriors, men as fierce and restless as he was, Dorius abandoned Sparta entirely, setting out to found a colony of his own where he could rule without compromise. His expedition would take him first to Libya and later to Sicily, chasing the illusion of independence. But the gods of war had no mercy for dreamers. In a foreign land, ambushed by the Carthaginians, Dorius and his men were slaughtered almost to the last. The warrior prince died not in triumph, but in exile, and his ashes never returned to Sparta. Back home, Cleomenes' reign began to unravel. The same instability that had once made him unpredictable now made him dangerous. He defied the ephors, the powerful magistrates who oversaw the kings. He waged wars without their approval, and rumors spread that he had bribed the Oracle of Delphi itself to remove a rival co-king. What began as ambition soon turned to madness. He was brilliant one day and violent the next, alternating between visionary and lunatic. The line between genius and insanity dissolved completely when his paranoia grew so uncontrollable that the ephors intervened. They declared their own king mentally unfit to rule, a sacrilege in itself, and ordered him imprisoned. The following morning, Cleomenes was found dead in his cell, not poisoned, not strangled, but dismembered by his own hand. He had convinced a guard to give him a knife and, methodically, piece by piece, cut himself apart until his blood soaked the floor. Sparta called it suicide, but even in antiquity, few believed it. It was far too clean, far too convenient for a kingdom desperate to restore its honor. In a single sweep of fate, both of Leonidas's brothers, one arrogant, one insane, were gone. The first had been crushed by his pride, the second by his madness, and so the youngest, the one destined for nothing, was suddenly the last name standing in a line of dead kings. Around 490 BCE, Leonidas ascended the throne of Sparta. He did not inherit it, he outlived it. He wore the crown not as a symbol of triumph, but as a reminder of what the agoge had taught him. Survival is not glory, it is purpose. Sparta had not chosen him for his nobility, it had simply burned away everyone else. The city that destroyed its children to harden them had finally produced its perfect creation. For the first time, Sparta was ruled not by a politician or a madman, but by its own reflection, disciplined, merciless, efficient. The monster was now king, and the world beyond the mountains was about to test what kind of creature had just taken the throne. When Leonidas took the throne, Sparta stood balanced between dread and destiny. Across the eastern horizon, a new storm gathered. King Xerxes of Persia, heir to Darius the Great, a ruler whose empire stretched from the Nile to the Indus. For nearly a decade he had prepared to erase Greece from the map, not merely as conquest but as vengeance. His father's army had been humiliated at Marathon, and the wound had never closed. Xerxes would finish what Darius had begun, and he would do it with numbers so vast that the ancient historians could only surrender to exaggeration. Millions, they said, a living ocean of soldiers and slaves pouring westward. The Hellespont itself was forced to serve as a road. Ships were lashed together into a bridge more than a kilometer long. When a storm tore it apart, Xerxes ordered the sea whipped 300 times and branded with hot irons, a king punishing nature for disobedience. Such was the arrogance now aimed at Greece. Before the armies came the ambassadors, robed in luxury and carrying a simple, terrible message. They demanded earth and water, the ancient tokens of submission, acknowledgement that the land one walked and the water one drank belonged henceforth to the King of Kings. One by one, the city-states faltered. Thessaly yielded, Boeotia bent the knee, even proud Argos made its peace. Fear, that oldest enemy of freedom, did what swords could not. Yet when the envoys entered Sparta's assembly hall, they found no theater for diplomacy, only a silence sharpened by discipline. The elders listened, neither impressed nor insulted. And then, without debate, they seized the Persian messengers, dragged them to the edge of a deep city well, and told them coldly, "There is your earth, and there is your water. Take them for yourselves." The thud of the bodies hitting stone was the sound of a door locking. The line between negotiation and annihilation had been crossed. From that moment, Sparta had sentenced itself and all of Greece to war. Panic rippled through the Hellenic world. Delegates hurried to assemble an alliance, and for the first time in memory, enemies sat at the same table. Athens, with her new fleet of triremes commanded by Themistocles, offered to hold the seas. Sparta, with the only standing army worthy of the name, would command the land. Strategy took shape. The navy would trap the Persian armada in the narrow straits, while a phalanx of hoplites would block the invaders at a mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, where the coastal cliffs forced any army into a single thin road. In that narrow throat, numbers would lose their meaning. Only discipline and geometry would decide the outcome. The plan was sound. The timing was impossible. The Persian columns were already moving when the Spartan priests announced the arrival of the Carnea, the holiest festival of the Spartan calendar, a season during which no army could march to war. To violate it would be to offend the gods themselves, and the ephors, guardians of tradition, refused to yield. The council chamber filled with furious debate. Every hour lost was an hour gained by Xerxes, yet the law was absolute. The city stood paralyzed between faith and survival. Leonidas, shaped by the agoge to find victory in constraint, saw what others missed. The crack in the wall. The law forbade the army from marching, but it said nothing about the king's personal guard. If he could not bring Sparta, he would bring its soul. He summoned 300 of his finest warriors, the hippies, chosen not for youth but for continuity. Each man must already have a living son to inherit his name. It was not sentiment but calculation. Leonidas knew the mission was a death sentence. He was ensuring that every bloodline represented among the 300 would survive their extinction. He explained nothing, asked for nothing, and when the list was complete, he ordered the men to prepare. To outsiders, it looked like a small reconnaissance force heading north. To Sparta, it was a funeral procession already written in history. They marched in silence, scarlet cloaks glinting under the sun, bronze shields reflecting the mountains they would never see again. Along the way, allies joined them, men from Thespiae, Phocis, Corinth, until the little column swelled to nearly 7,000. Yet even with this reinforcement, Leonidas understood the mathematics of doom. They would not stop Xerxes, they would delay him. And delay was all Greece needed. Before reaching the pass, the king halted at Delphi to consult the oracle of Apollo. The priestess, speaking in a voice that seemed half human, half wind, delivered the prophecy that sealed his purpose. Either Sparta would fall, or one of her kings must die. To most men that would sound like a curse, to Leonidas it was permission. The Agoga had taught him to see death not as failure, but as fulfillment. A king could not choose his end, but he could choose its use. When the 300 and their companions arrived at Thermopylae, the air stank of sulfur from the hot springs and salt from the nearby sea. The mountains pressed so close that 2 chariots could barely pass abreast. It was the perfect place to trade bodies for time. Leonidas ordered the ancient Phocian wall rebuilt, set sentries on the goat path above the cliffs, and let his men rest for the night. They sharpened their spears, oiled their armor, and ate in silence. Behind them lay a country still arguing about festivals. Before them lay the greatest empire on earth. The monster Sparta had made now stood exactly where destiny demanded him, between a world that prayed for freedom and a god-king who believed he could whip the sea. Dawn rose behind the mountains like a blade drawn from its sheath. Beneath the cold sky, the Persian camp spread across the plain in every direction. Tents, banners, and smoke curling from thousands of cook fires that fed an army larger than imagination could hold. When Xerxes finally rode forward to see the pass for himself, he saw not a grand defense but a narrow throat of stone, a thin wall of rebuilt rubble, and at its center a cluster of men polishing their armor as if preparing for a festival rather than a siege. The sight insulted him. He sent another messenger offering mercy if they surrendered their weapons. The reply came, brief and flawless, a lesson in the language of Laconia, molon labe. There was no more diplomacy to attempt, only arithmetic, and Xerxes believed that numbers never lied. He ordered the first wave forward. The Medes advanced in their bright armor and painted shields, shouting to shake the sky, but the pass betrayed them. The ground funneled them into a narrow column where their numbers became a burden. When the front ranks struck the Greek line, they found no panic, no noise, only the dull rhythm of bronze against bronze. The Spartan phalanx absorbed the impact like a wall alive with breath and heartbeat. Behind the locked shields, the second and third ranks drove their dory spears over the shoulders of the men in front, turning the formation into a forest of points. The Medes could not break it. Those behind them could not see it. They were crushed between their comrades in the wall, trampled by the weight of their own charge. When the order to retreat finally reached the front, there was nowhere left to retreat to. The day ended with the pass carpeted in bodies, and the sea below running red with what the mountain would not hold. On the second morning, Xerxes abandoned patience. He sent in his chosen soldiers, the Immortals, 10,000 men whose number never fell, for each casualty was instantly replaced. They were disciplined, trained, and utterly confident that the world's greatest king would not expose them to failure. But the phalanx was not an opponent, it was a mechanism. When the Immortals pressed forward, the Spartans stepped back in perfect rhythm, luring them into the choke point until the ground itself conspired against them. Then the order rose from the front, othismos, the push. The rear ranks heaved, the spears bristled forward, and the Immortals were driven onto the very corpses of the men who had charged before them. Their silk armor split, their shields bent, and they died without ever reaching the Spartan line. Arrows rained down, darkening the sky, but the bronze shields locked overhead turned daylight into shadow, and the shadow into safety. The air filled with the roar of iron, and when at last the horn sounded for withdrawal, the pass still belonged to the 300. Xerxes watched from his chariot, disbelief hardening into rage. 2 days, tens of thousands of men, and the road to Greece remained closed. No king of kings could endure such humiliation. He demanded the night be filled with plans, punishments, and promises of reward for anyone who could find a weakness in the mountain wall that had defied him. And as if conjured from the darkness itself, the answer came. a local man named Ephialtes, thin and trembling, driven by greed or cowardice, revealing a hidden path that twisted through the forested slopes above the Spartan camp. It was a shepherd's trail, narrow and steep, but it looped behind the defenders and descended into the rear of the pass. Xerxes seized upon the treachery without hesitation. He dispatched Hydarnes and his immortals to march through the night, promising them glory for surrounding the enemy before dawn. Down below, Leonidas sensed the shift long before the messenger arrived. He could read the silence of the hills as easily as he once read the silence of the barracks. The mountain's breath had changed. The birds no longer stirred. When confirmation came that the Persians had found the back road, he gathered his captains beneath the fading torches. The debate that followed was brief but bitter. Some urged retreat to fight another day. Others begged to hold until reinforcements arrived. Leonidas ended the argument the way Sparta had trained him to end all things, with decision. The prophecy of Delphi echoed in his mind: either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die. The oracle had spoken. The monster accepted his script. He dismissed the allied contingents, ordering them to carry word south and prepare the next defense line. Those who chose to remain would die beside him, not as soldiers of different cities, but as brothers. As dawn began to climb once more over the ridges, the 300 stood in the sulfur mist of Thermopylae, knowing that every heartbeat now belonged to legend. They had held the greatest army in the world for 2 days, and now they would meet it face to face from both directions. There would be no retreat, no new orders, no hope of reinforcement. Yet among them there was no panic, no prayer for mercy, only the same quiet efficiency that the agoge had beaten into them since childhood. Shields were lifted, helmets adjusted, and Leonidas looked once more toward the mouth of the pass where the banners of Persia were already moving. He had learned as a boy that pain meant nothing, and now he would teach the greatest empire on earth that fear could be taught the same lesson. The 3rd day of Thermopylae was about to begin, and the monster of Sparta was ready to make his final offering. The mountain was still dark when the sentries returned with the final message. The immortals had breached the goat path. The trap was closing, and the Persians would soon be at their backs. The pass of Thermopylae had become a tomb. Leonidas stood among his men, calm as a statue carved from the same stone that surrounded them. He did not rage, did not lament, for he had known this ending from the moment he marched north. The oracle's voice had already buried him. What remained was only the manner of his dying and the meaning it would leave behind. He summoned his commanders and gave the order that would outlive him. All allied forces who wished to flee were to withdraw at once, to carry news of the invasion to Athens, Corinth, and the rest of Greece, to warn them and prepare the next defense. Those who stayed would do so by choice, bound not by command, but by conviction. The Thespians refused to leave. They preferred death beside Spartans to life beneath Persia. The Thebans stayed as well, though Leonidas doubted their loyalty and kept them close as unwilling hostages of fate. 1,000 men remained in the shadow of the hot gates to meet the dawn with iron hearts. Before the light rose, Leonidas performed one final duty that no historian can fully capture. He walked through the lines in silence, touching shoulders, meeting eyes, reminding each man what it meant to stand unbroken. There was no speech, no grand declaration, only the quiet understanding that every life here was a coin already spent. Then he turned toward his captains and gave the command that has never been forgotten. "Spartans, eat well, for tonight we dine in Hades." It was not poetry or prophecy, but logistics, a soldier's order to fill one's stomach before the long march into death. The men obeyed, eating in calm silence while the sky reddened above the ridges, until the horns of Persia began to wail, and the rumble of feet shook the ground like thunder rolling through a canyon. When the Persians advanced, they expected the Greeks to retreat. Instead, the phalanx opened and surged forward. The 300 and their allies charged downhill into the mass of bodies with a roar that broke the air itself. The collision was not a battle, but an act of will. Spears shattered, shields split, swords snapped, and men fought with broken bronze, with helmets, with bare hands. Leonidas was everywhere at once, at the front line, at the flank, wherever the wall trembled. The Persians, shocked by this final onslaught, wavered, and for a few glorious moments the tide reversed. The monster that Sparta had built was unleashed without restraint, and its ferocity stunned even the god-king watching from his chariot. But numbers do not tire, and discipline cannot defy mathematics forever. In the chaos of the melee, arrows hissed through the smoke and found the king. He fell among the bodies of his guards, and the line shuddered but did not break. The fight shifted to the ground around his corpse. 4 times the Persians tried to seize it, and 4 times they were driven back, leaving piles of their own dead in the dust. Only when the last of Leonidas's brothers in arms were crushed beneath their shields did the enemy at last claim his body. Xerxes, enraged by the cost of his victory, ordered the corpse displayed as a warning to the world. The head of the Spartan king was mounted on a spear and lifted high for all to see, but the lesson he hoped to teach dissolved in the wind. Among the Greeks, the mutilation of the dead was not terror but sacrilege, and that act of desecration transformed defeat into martyrdom. Runners escaped south carrying the story, not of a massacre, but of sacrifice. They told of the prophecy fulfilled, of the king who chose death so that his city might live, of 300 men who stood against the largest army the earth had ever known. Across the Aegean, the tale struck like lightning. Shame became steel. The hesitant cities that had wavered between surrender and resistance now found themselves united by outrage. Themistocles, waiting with his fleet near Salamis, used that spark to ignite his own trap. Weeks later, when the Persian navy entered the narrow straits, the Greek triremes slammed into them from both sides and shattered the floating empire. Xerxes, watching from the shore, saw his invincible fleet drown before his eyes and fled back to Asia, leaving his vast army stranded and leaderless. A year later, at Plataea, Spartan hoplites charged across the plain and finished what Leonidas had begun. The empire that had called itself eternal broke upon the shield of a dead king. In the end, the prophecy was exact. A Spartan king did die, and Sparta was saved. But the cost was more than blood. The Agoga had taken a boy and stripped him of compassion. The state had taken a man and turned him into a weapon, and the gods had taken that weapon and made of it a symbol. Leonidas was never a philosopher or a saint. He was not a builder of temples or a patron of poets. He was the creation of a system that worshipped endurance and purity of purpose above all else, a man sculpted by cruelty to defend the fragile idea of freedom. Xerxes believed he had erased him by displaying his head. Instead, he had immortalized him. For centuries afterward, travelers crossing the pass would stop before the stone lion carved in his honor and read the words cut into its base. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The monster that Sparta forged became the shield of all Greece, and in dying, Leonidas achieved the one victory the Persians could never understand, the conquest of time itself.